Thank you, everybody, for a very warm welcome that you extended to me. You know, the traffic was bad this morning, but after much weaving and tailgating and queue jumping, I got here. And incidentally, that's how I got in Australia in the first place. At least according to some of our politicians, isn't it? Well, I'd like to first of all pay my respect and acknowledge the traditional custodians of the sacred lands on which this meeting, this gathering takes place, and also pay respect to elders, both past and present. Well, friends, especially the ladies, shall I begin by singing for you Frank Sinatra's My Way? And now the end is near. Well, why? The Trump era has begun. Some of us might think it's an era, not an era. He was sworn in amid much pomp and ceremony last Saturday, as you know. But the day after, tens of thousands of people, especially women in America and across the globe, held rallies in protest against his presidency. Pope Francis sent him a short letter of congratulations, along with a rather subtly pointed message, which I'm not sure is appreciated by the new president, given his anti-immigration campaign rhetoric. And I quote, "Under your leadership, may America's stature continue to be measured above all by its concern for the poor, the outcast, and those in need who, like Lazarus, stand before our door, or perhaps before our wall." The seasoned observer would recognize in this message a kind of Jesuitic backhand serve to Mr. Trump's infamous wall-building call. Unlike at my installation ceremony, the Holy Father's message was not read out at President Trump's inauguration. It might have been a bit of a party pooper. One can surmise that perhaps the two leaders are guided by very different visions. We're not here to talk about Mr. Trump's vision for America or for the world. We're here to be inspired by a vision for Catholic schools in our diocese, which is rooted in the gospel of Jesus Christ. The Pope's message, which I quoted above, gives us an insight into that vision. In fact, we could almost paraphrase that sentence in order to remind us of the fundamental thrust of the gospel of Christ. So it might read like this: under our system leadership, may our Catholic school system's stature be measured above all by its concern for the poor, the outcast, and those in need who, like Lazarus, stand before our door. I contend, friends, that this is our mandate, rooted in the gospel and enshrined in the Church's age-old tradition of preferential option for the poor. The Lazaruses who stand before the doors of our schools, in this case, are not Mexicans or impoverished migrants from Latin America. In the context of education in Australia and in our diocese in particular, they are the marginalized and the most vulnerable, for whom Catholic schools exist as a sign of the Church's unwavering commitment. Catholic schools have always been charged with that special mandate to offer hope to those who are disadvantaged, and this attention for those who are weakest, who are the battlers, is as Australian as Eureka and Penola. The Australian Catholic education has been held as a jewel and the envy of other nations. Even from earlier days, the concern to provide a religious education for Catholic families in the colony galvanized the bishops of Australia. Their vision was brought to life by religious men and women who responded courageously to the invitation to give opportunity to young and often impoverished Catholics. These poor, socially disadvantaged, and in the post-war period, immigrant children, and this special attention to them in Catholic education has not been diminished with the transition from religious to lay leadership. A strong commitment to professional development, like what we're doing here today, especially in respect of the mission, identity, and ethos of Catholic schools, continues to guide us to meet the challenges of the 21st century. I'm not an expert in Catholic education in Parramatta or Australia generally. I believe that though Catholic schools are both successful and popular generally, the challenge to our mission towards the socially disadvantaged in the community is still to be met with the passion of the gospel. Dr. Anne Benjamin, Greg's predecessor, in her paper, Catholic Schools and the Cry of the Poor, which was presented in 2008, invites us to address some of the worrying trends in Catholic education. I'm not sure if the figures collected nearly 10 years ago are still valid today, but if they are, we Catholic leaders should be concerned. Why? For example, based on the 2006 census, low-income Catholic families were twice as likely to be enrolled at a government school rather than a Catholic school. Our SWD student enrollments were more than 2% lower than those in government schools. And the same goes for Indigenous students. Catholic schools enrolled, according to the census, less than half of the expected Catholic sector student share of Indigenous students. Many questions are suggested by these figures. Do families of these children freely choose not to attend a Catholic school? Or are there factors which create barriers, walls, so that Catholic schools cease to be a feasible option for them? Dr. Benjamin draws some candid conclusions, in my opinion. To the extent, she says, that families of needier students do feel excluded, then Catholic schools are failing in their mission. To the extent, she continues, that the poorest and wealthiest families are sending their children elsewhere, Catholic school education becomes impoverished and risks providing neither a truly comprehensive education or a truly ecclesial experience. I'd like to think that Catholic schools in our diocese are committed to providing truly comprehensive education and truly ecclesial experience for all. When Catholic schools at both ends of the socio-economic spectrum, in other words, high and low income, opt for schools other than ours, that commitment, I believe, needs to be revisited and reaffirmed accordingly. We need to recognize and remove the barriers which exclude the very people for whom we have that special mandate to provide hope. We need to create conditions which are favorable for greater inclusion of those who are most loved by God. In the words of Pope Francis, We need to be the church that offers nearness, proximity, even like a field hospital to those on the peripheries of society. It is easier said than done, isn't it? When I was an auxiliary bishop in Melbourne, I was involved in the planning of a parish-based residential care for people with mental disabilities. We were careful to plan or to prepare the community for this venture, and especially the Catholic school that was close to the proposed site. We held information sessions and ran PR campaigns in order to allay fears and concerns. Then I moved to Parramatta in the middle of the final planning stages. You know, the last thing I heard was that the whole project had fallen through because of community protests, and the most vocal of which was from, yes, you might have guessed it, the Catholic school nearby. Now, there might have been legitimate concerns that people, especially parents of those students, felt had not been addressed with satisfaction. But when it comes to dealing with sensitive issues like accommodating people with disabilities, I wonder if the Catholic faith makes any significant difference in terms of the attitude of some towards them. Closer to home, a couple shared with me the painful struggle they had had in trying to enroll their young child with disability in one of our Catholic schools, or several of our Catholic schools. They were met with a lack of empathy, even with opposition and rejection at the first encounter. This was not just one school, but 6. They approached seven Catholic schools in our diocese, meeting with 7 principals, and were made to feel rejected and unwelcomed by all except one. But so determined to have their child enrolled in an inclusive mainstream education rather than a special needs school or a non-Catholic school, the parents moved 2 suburbs away from their original home to their new accepting CEDP school. I'm very relieved that at least one school of ours reached out to them, and the story of those struggling parents ended on a happy note. The student concerned has integrated exceptionally well with the support of the school community concerned and the CEDP head office. I'm not saying this to name or shame anybody. I'm just wondering if there needs to be a cultural, a attitudinal change on our part in order to accommodate and accompany better. Accommodate and accompany better the students who are on the periphery, and whatever forms of periphery that may be. How do we as Catholic school leaders, who are people of commitment, passion, and imagination, address the challenge of outreach to the poor, the marginalized, and the vulnerable children? How can we respond to the challenge of Pope Francis in going to the new peripheries, the socio-economically disadvantaged, the SWD, the families without values or even without faith, the broken and the dysfunctional, etc., in order to offer that nearness, that proximity that Pope Francis insists on? How do our school communities personify the powerlessness and the compassion of Christ? How do we balance the need for recognition and success and popularity on the one hand, and that fundamental Christian ethos of care for the weakest on the other. So I invite you today to reflect together on these questions. For me, they touch the heart of the gospel, the heart of our Catholic faith, mission and witness. I'd like to also offer you some thoughts on what it means for me to be a Catholic leader. Leaders who lead from the margins. That's the first characteristic. The first characteristic of a leader in mission is that ability to accompany people from the margins into a journey towards the fullness of life and love. I have come that others might have life and have it to the full. That's our gospel mandate. It is to embrace that call of the Vatican Council to identify with the joys and hopes, the griefs and anxieties of those who are poor or in any way afflicted. And to do this, we must be able to live in and to bridge that yawning gap, that liminal space between the ideal and the real. Pope Francis, in the most recent interview, reiterated his constant call for us to be close to the people. He said that the hallmark of the church is its proximity to the people. His fear isn't just the opposition from certain quarters of the church, including certain cardinals. His fear is that the church becomes what he calls anesthetized or removed from the sufferings of the people. It is interesting to note his comment about the people's priest that he was in Argentina. He said that in his heart, he's still a street priest with a driving passion to be close to the people, even if now he occupies the throne of Peter. The Holy Father set an example and a challenge for us, whoever we are and whatever we do, never to lose sight of the divine pathos and God's preferential option for the poor. It is a vocation of the Christian leader to be with his people in their hopes and struggles, anxieties and fears, to be that Malcolm in the middle who occupies in betwixt and between the liminal, the peripheral, the precarious spaces. Not easy to be in the middle, to be loyal to both ends of the spectrum, to belong to the church of orthodoxy, and yet also to minister in the world of the very unorthodox sometimes, a lot of times. It is really between the rock and the hard place, yet that is the calling of the leader, because we are meant to be in the cold face, in the messiness of it all, and yet with that strong driving passion for the gospel. Leaders who embrace servanthood and vulnerability, that's the second characteristic. The Christian leader today must be one who manifests that servant leadership of Christ. It is often on those who pride themselves on being the icon of Jesus Christ, the humble servant, and yet demonstrate very little humility thereof. I recall a couple of occasions where the priest or the bishop came across not as humble servants, but more like feudal lords. I remember my first reconciliation experience. Now, you know, the dark box experience, right? Some of you might have had that experience. We lined up on both sides of the confessional and waited very nervously for our turns. I rehearsed my sins a dozen times, even with the help of my fellow penitents. And yet, when I came to that dark box and knelt down, I could not utter a word. I froze. I was stupefied out of that gripping fear. The priest was unimpressed by my silence. He promptly got out of his seat, went over to my side, dragged me by the ear, and placed me at the end of the line. Now that would have meant another 2 hours of waiting. And no, he hadn't finished yet. When he placed me at the end of the line, the queue, he gave me a mighty slap on the face before storming back to his seat. We were just in awe of his power. As for the power of the bishop, it was even more formidable. I remember on one occasion, we children lined up on the main street of the village to form like a guard of honor for a bishop. We waited for hours pardon me, in the hot tropical sun, and yet he was nowhere to be seen. And finally, when he did arrive, his black Mercedes sped us by so quickly that we could not even see him for the billow of dust that swirled around his vehicle. This was the time when in the village it was considered a luxury to own a bicycle. These images are etched in my memory as I recall my Catholic upbringing. They are more pleasant memories, of course, but these are highlighted in order to put into sharp relief my childhood experience of clericalism. In Australia, the priesthood no longer enjoys that kind of prestige and power. For a lot of young people, it's no longer surrounded with the aura of mystique and fascination. However, this loss of prestige does not always mean that we are seen as icons of Jesus Christ, the humble servant. To truly reclaim this essential quality, we must go to the heart of what it means to be a servant leader. The servant leadership model is much more than what we do to the people. It is indicative of who we are as humble and vulnerable servants in the likeness of Christ, who came to serve and to give his own life for others. Hence, it is a way of life, a modus vivendi, before it can be translated into a way of service, a modus operandi. We Christians today are more than ever challenged to embrace self-giving, which is at the heart of the gospel. Leaders who listen, who discern, and act collegially. The final characteristic of a leader that in mission I'd like to propose is that the ability to listen, to discern, and to act collaboratively or collegially. In a world which is suspicious of, at best, or hostile at worst, to institutional religions, our response is not of fearful retreat, disengagement, or sectarian mentality, but of openness, faith, courage, as we're called to accompany people in the new Exodus. And I like that quote that's in Greg's presentation, to sing the Lord's song on an alien land. The alien lands being the secularized world in which we are living, and the Lord's song being the gospel of Jesus Christ. Here we have the example of Pope Francis's leadership in fostering open dialogue, discussion, and initiative is illuminating. Collegiality and synodality are the keys to understanding his style and vision of governance. For him, the conversion of hearts is more important than the conversion of structures. The latter are meant to be instruments of listening, consulting, and deciding collegially. Every structure is to develop the ability for us to listen, to discern for ourselves the signs of the times, and to plan for the future. This is why the Pope does not believe that he should have the answers to all the questions facing local churches. He favors local initiative over central control and sees the identity of the church to lie in its going out to the margins, to the periphery. Furthermore, he carefully considers every step to further and expand the footprint of synodality, a wider sense of discussion within the church. His basic idea is that of a missionary and a dialogical church going out of itself, a church that is open, that is present with the people. Coupled with his conviction that the poor evangelize is Pope Francis's understanding of the church of the peripheries as a way to evangelize and purify Rome, which he considers too self-referential. We must learn and live as a minority in the midst of a secular and diverse society. The nostalgia for the Church of Christendom, in my view, is a fantasy. That strong, powerful, rich, privileged, socially dominant, politically influential church. In this time of diminishment, we must learn to influence society, not as lords and masters, but as fellow pilgrims, as critical yeasts in critical times. Vatican II taught us it is a pilgrim church who walks humbly with others and engages with them in the discernment of authentic values and in the search for and the delivery of the fullness of life to the world. Therefore, instead of seeking to regain lost ground in the relentless process of secularization, Christians today must learn to engage with others and to act as leaven in a pluralistic society. As the church is transitioned from a position of power, privilege, size, and success to that of powerlessness, servanthood, minority, and humility, we as her servants are called to embody that process of rebirthing. We ourselves need to abandon power in favor of powerlessness, clericalism in favor of service, superiority and elitism in favor of humility, dominance and control in favor of mutuality and collaborative ministry. Didn't you? I'll read more slowly. Don't worry, it happens to me too. I find Henry Newman's commentary on the temptations of Jesus very insightful. Henry identifies three powerful tendencies in Christian leadership that correspond to three temptations of Christ. The first is the temptation to be relevant, which is that irresistible pull to be indispensable, competent, productive, and in control. Our call today, Henry would contend, is the call to die to our ambition and desire for success and to rise to the power of vulnerable trust. In other words, we must learn to be a contemplative mystic whose identity is rooted in God's love and not in the illusion of self-made success. The second temptation is that to be spectacular, which is tantamount to the cult of popularity and individual heroism. Our call today is to learn and minister in mutuality, in collaboration, in humble recognition of our woundedness. The third is the temptation to be powerful. Henri speaks of this temptation as follows. Much Christian leadership is exercised by people who do not know how to develop healthy, intimate relationships and have opted for power and control instead. Many Christian empire builders have been people unable to give and receive love. And I think these sobering words are particularly relevant for us priests. As true ministers, the challenge for us today is not to do more and to achieve more, but to be more deeply grounded in God's love. It's not about the quantity of our actions and accomplishments, it's about the quality of our relationships. And you know that story in The Little Flower of St. Francis, the joy, the perfect joy. Francis and his friend, Brother Leo, were walking down the hill after a week in solitude and penance. And he asked Brother Leo, what is, in your opinion, is perfect joy? And Leo listed a whole lot of things. Perhaps when our order had smart people, theologians in places of learning like Paris, Bologna, London, Cologne, those medieval centers of learning. Francis shook his head and said, no. What about when we were numerous? Our friars went to the ends of the earth, as our Lord said, doing the work of the gospel. Francis shook his head, said, no, that's not perfect joy. Perfect joy is when you and I, hungry, exhausted from a week of solitude and penance in the woods, went to the monastery, one of ours, and the friars took us to be brigands and vagrants and chased us away and beat us and abused us. If we endured all of these things for the love of the gospel, that's perfect joy. And I think that it's a bit simplistic, but it has, I believe, a powerful message, which is success is not the ultimate measure. Popularity is not the ultimate measure, as far as we are concerned. Catholic schools are not about those things. It's about embodying the gospel message of Christ. It's about embedding that culture of care, especially that care for the weakest and the most vulnerable. That's being authentically Catholic. So I've outlined for you some fundamental characteristics of a leadership for mission. The commitment to stand in a liminal space, the commitment to embrace vulnerability and servanthood, and the commitment to discern and act collegially. These are by no means comprehensive. Rather, I believe that they are the basic qualities that enable us to be authentic leaders. The arrival and the leadership of Pope Francis have signaled a new era for the Church. He has refocused on the proclamation of God's love for the poor, the vulnerable, and the marginalized. He has firmly placed that pastoral emphasis on the dignity of every person. He has committed the Church to the way of engagement, affirmation, and compassion, which is at the heart of the gospel. The Church can be only the conduit of compassion and speak the language of hope to a broken humanity when it truly personifies powerlessness and stands where Christ once stood. That is firmly on the side of the outcast and the most vulnerable. Catholic schools are premised on the fundamental dignity of each and every person. They are charged with that special mandate to offer hope to those who are disadvantaged. And this special attention for the neediest is a cherished part of the Australian Catholic school story. In reading the signs of the times, we are particularly challenged to be places which are deeply rooted in the gospel values and where the radical vision of fullness of life for the poor is fully embraced. The challenge of Pope Francis for the Church to be bruised, wounded, and hurt because of its daring commitment to the vulnerable is poignant to us, Catholic educators, leaders, to reach out to those who are on the margins of society, even at the cost of our own success and power and popularity, remains the fundamental gospel imperative. To go to the peripheries and to discover new horizons in Catholic education remains the challenge of our mission. And I'd like to conclude this reflection with an appeal to us from the couple whose story I shared with you earlier. Our wish is that at this year's System Leadership Day, the good work of CDP and Catholic schools do in inclusion of children with disabilities in mainstream Catholic schools are celebrated, that families are like ours are encouraged to enter and participate fully within their local Catholic community, that schools and principals in particular will continue to have the courage to leave their comfort zones and discover the presence, the beauty, the love of God in the margins, in the shadows of life, and continue to accept children with disabilities in their schools. Thank you for listening, everyone.